Hi, I'm Lidia Lae. Welcome to another episode of Culture Shapers, where I interview world experts in their fields, authors, creators, and influencers who are making a significant contribution to our world by shaping our cultures. These are everyday people doing extraordinary things. Today, we have a special guest. We have Steve Brock. Steve runs his own branding agency with working with some of the top corporations and nonprofits in the US. And in addition, he's a writer, an author actually. So I've got one of Steve's book, The Hidden Travel. I love this book because it showcases Steve's photography, just beautiful images that he has throughout, but he offers a lot of insights into how to make your travel so much more meaningful. And I've learned that Steve has another forthcoming book in January called The Creative Wild. Love that title. Now, Steve's also a photographer, a traveler who's traveled to over 50 countries and much more. He's relentless in his curiosity that makes him someone who appreciates the value, power, and mystery of culture. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. Steve, could you share with us more about yourself that I've missed that people need to know about you?
Okay, thanks, Lydia. It's great to be here. Let's see. I would say a couple of things about the culture piece is that I first became, I won't say aware of culture, but really as a academic study, more in-depth aware of it in graduate school. So I have an MBA in international management, and so one of the classes after graduating there, I taught a graduate program in China, and one of the components of it. It was really a class on international marketing and trade, but one of our segments was on international or just cross-cultural communications. And so then I started getting more into the academic studies of culture and cross-cultural issues and found it fascinating. And I've used it ever since. In work in branding, you have to understand culture because in large part, when we talk about branding, and I'm not just meaning like logo and tagline, but the overall process of how an organization thinks of itself and communicates and tells its story. And that really gets manifested in the culture of the organization. So if you just work on the external communications pieces, the the overused little saying of lipstick on a pig comes to mind because you're just changing some of the superficials and going deeper into the culture is what really transforms an organization. So that's on an organizational level. And then through the travel, it has been really, gosh, a real joy to understand or try to understand new cultures, how people respond, act, understanding why knowing just even a little bit of a language is so important towards not just communicating, but really going deeper in the language itself. And so when you understand even things like, for example, like in Mandarin Chinese, right, or Chinese in general, right, how the characters, how they're formed, actually tells you something of the historical meaning and how people, like when the character for woman and the character for child together makes the character for good, it tells you something about how the culture thinks about different things. So all of that kind of gets blurred and just becomes part of the fun discovery of new cultures and even cultural issues, within family, within the community, etc.
Wow, that is a lot of deep insights that you've talked as a branding expert. And, you're touching on culture as vital to understanding how to reach people and how to make the message meaningful to different cultures and different people in those cultures. So I really value that. And I think, your depth shines through in your books. And I want to know, Steve, as a traveler and author, how do you actually balance the external exploration with internal reflection, especially in discovering the cultural gems?
Mhm. Well, so my website, my blog, and all the travel related, and even the creativity stuff is all on a site now. It's called Explore Your Worlds, plural. And the impetus of that name was it's about exploring the world inside you and the world around you. And where do those two come together? So that's a great question. I think that those two, to me, in travel, for example, they really are closely tied together because part of it means the world inside you are the things that are your kind of deepest longings and drivers and desires, and how you take those on any type of a trip. So it's not just a kind of fun vacation or a relaxing lying on the beach thing, but how do you take those interests and passions that are internal and then experience them more in the external world around you, which is going to be a new external reality, right? When you're on a trip. But like if you're interested in, say, you mentioned like photography, and that's an easy, obvious one is uh, when I travel, the internal kind of thinking about what's the story I want to tell with this image? What's the story that I want to capture or understand here? It becomes manifested externally in terms of everything I'm seeing, but I'm still processing it internally. I know there was a writer and a photographer from National Geographic who
Mm-hmm.
once said is if you do not know the story you are trying to capture in a place, you will end up taking photos that look like everyone else's, right? So there's something about this internal processing, this internal way of seeing the world that you're able to bring to a place so that what you get from that place, that becomes richer when you've had some sort of reflective aspect to it as well.
It's like you bring intention into everything you do, and that's a very powerful way of living.
Right, right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think intentionality is probably one of the biggest aspects of what separates a meaningful and a non-meaningful experience, because you can have a meaningful experience that's just serendipitous, but you'll increase the likelihood of those happening when you're more intentional about it.
Yeah, no, that's very powerful, Steve.
Mm,
And as a fellow writer, I want to know from you, because you're a very intentional guy. Where do
mm,
you find your creativity as a writer? Especially when you've combined the themes of travel and self-discovery in your book, The Hidden Travel. Where does that
mm.
creativity come from?
That's the age-old question, right? Does anyone know? I think it comes from developing creativity almost as a muscle, right? That it's not something if you kind of go someplace, and that's the danger of going on a trip hoping to be inspired. The norm, actually, not the exception, but the norm I've seen with most people who go for a relatively short, say 2 or 3 weeks, and I say relatively compared to like if you're going overseas and you're, renting a villa in Tuscany to write your next novel, right? Longer period, different thing. But for a shorter period of time, a lot of people go expecting to have these like, oh, I'm going to have these epiphanies. I'm going to have these great insights and this great inspiration, all these new ideas, and nothing happens, right? Nothing at all happens on the trip. And they're come home kind of like almost depressed by that until 2 to 3 weeks after they get back. Then all of a sudden the floodgates open, right? And everything starts becoming, open and flowing there. And so I think that that's part of it is recognizing inspiration. You can't really control it. And like, I think it's Chuck Close who said, the artist, the visual artist who said, inspiration is for amateurs. Professionals just show up and do the work, right? So there's something about that I think is true that when you get into the rhythm, you get into the practice or discipline, like we
Yes.
talked about, intentionality of doing the work on a daily basis. You don't have to rely on inspiration. It kind of comes as part of the territory and you just show up. And yes, some days are going to be more inspired or you're going to be able to get into that flow state easier. But for the most part, I think it's opening yourself to as wide a number of kind of inputs, as you will. So there's this sense of they talk about it is convergent thinking, divergent thinking. Divergent meaning you're getting, ideas from unrelated areas. And I think the more curious you are
Mm,
about a wider range of things, the easier it is to be inspired because you start going and say, oh, I saw this over in this garage
yeah.
over here in this part of town. And over here, this guy in this restaurant's talking about this. And somehow, what if, right? And you start making these connections.
No, that's wonderful. I like your metaphor of creativity as a muscle you build, and
Mm,
also it's and the creativity making the associations where you've just pointed out, I saw this, and then the association link with there with curiosity. I
yeah.
love what you said about curiosity because it's like the source of creativity.
Mm,
So thanks
it
so
is.
much for that insight, Steve. And
Yeah.
I have actually had a sneak preview of your new book, The Creative Wild. Do you want to
Yeah, yeah, I
share
got
that?
ooh.
Wow, I love the book cover. Steve, share with us, why did you write this book?
Because, there's a lot of books on creativity out there. So I don't want to just, reinvent the wheel and everything. But what I found is, in part, this book is written for kind of a faith-based audience because there's a lot of folks out there. So a lot of the nonprofits I work with are faith-based.
Yes,
And I see that there is this kind of reluctance within, particularly like within a lot of Christian organizations, to really step out and embrace kind of creativity because it feels a little dangerous to a lot of them and everything. And I just find it really fascinating because back to this other issue of inspiration and everything else, I find that kind of a faith perspective or a spiritual perspective actually opens you to greater appreciation of mystery and wonder. Okay. So you have all these things going for you in kind of the spiritual realm, but you're not connecting it to the creative process. And so that's what the book does a little bit. So it has kind of that as one emphasis. The other reason for it is that so you mentioned like the photography, but and the writing, but I do painting and sketching. I
oh,
do
wow.
woodworking and furniture design, cooking, music. I used to be a magician and through college, and so I have all these creative interests. And what I find is a lot of the books that are out there, they tend to be written either for an artist of some sort or a writer, or
Yeah,
they tend to be in the business world, right? And so those tend to be more about innovation and ideation, and then there's other ones that are more around the craft arts and crafts type of things. And then there's a few others that are around the neuroscience related to creativity. Okay, but there's very few that actually cross all those domains. And that's what this book does because my background in branding and innovation work in the business world helps me to see things from that perspective. But then personally, the more artistic side of it comes in there. And then there's the pragmatic side too. It's just like I kind of like to see like design thinking. How do we apply design towards solving problems as well? So all those worlds come together here, and that's something that I haven't seen too much of a book that combines all those.
oh, I love that, Steve. I love how you are immersed in many different worlds, the business world, but also the creative world. And, in the spiritual world, you tap into that. And I love how you mentioned that you're bringing all of these in together to integrate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, what I want to know from you is what unexpected places have inspired your most creative insights while you're writing and working on this book, and why?
Okay, so if I were to like catalog where I have had the most breakthrough ideas, I
Yes.
would say that usually occur on an airplane seat.
Oh, interesting.
Because yeah, and here's the reason for it is because I treat that almost like sacred space, right? Because I don't connect to email. I don't even connect to Wi-Fi so
Yeah.
that I don't have all those distractions which I have at home or at the office, that type of a thing. So I have a kind of, 4 hour, 5 hour, even a 2 hour flight. I have that time. Now, yes, in today's, post pandemic world where flying is rare that you have a seat that's open next to you,
Yes.
it can be a little bit, the butt, as they call it in sales or in like retail sales, they talk about the butt bump factor, which means that they actually have done research and shows that if the aisles of the store are too narrow and a person bumps into your behind there, you will purchase far less than if you have, more space. And so there's this issue of the sheer comfort of it can affect it. But all that to say is, yeah, it's just this great space where it's away from home. Haven't got to the place yet. Because in a destination, believe it or not, I
Yes.
don't find it to be as necessarily inspiring for the reasons we talked about before on the ground because I'm still processing. I'm kind of still thinking about the travel aspects of it. So the creativity and everything comes more, I think, from the place. But here's the interesting thing. 10, 15 years ago, I would have said that the places themselves are the most inspiring part and things I like most about travel. Not
Yeah.
true anymore. The thing I like most about travel are the people. Almost every, and it's not just me, even the biggest introvert, if you ask them what were the most meaningful moments on a trip, they're almost always around the people.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, is right, culture is inhabited in the
Yeah.
places, in the architecture, but even more so in the people, because it's a living culture there, right? You go to Europe, you go to, we were just in Japan earlier, and you're in a place that's 1,000 years old. So the place itself has been around, but what happened there 1,000 years ago is a different culture in some ways than what's happening in the lives of people today. So
Mm.
encountering those, seeing the living culture, engaging with that, seeing how your culture and what you bring to it, relates. And I would say one last thing on this is in my travel writing, I've made a big deal because in travel circles, there's a big push for people to become insiders. It's like, oh, slow travel, learn to live in a place long enough and become an insider there. And honestly, I don't actually believe that most of us can ever become insiders to a culture unless you've literally been there for decades, right? And even then, like in Japan, in Kyoto, for example, they say if you haven't lived in Japan for at least 5 generations, you're still an outsider, right? It goes that far back there. But this idea of being an outsider is actually a wonderful thing because you can point out aspects of the culture and
Yeah.
of the place itself that locals have lost sight of, right? And we all do it. We all become too
Right.
familiar with things around us. So that outsider role is actually a wonderful role because
Mm.
you can honor their culture by, being really grateful for it and being appreciative of everything you're seeing. And it helps them see with new eyes as well. So I think there's all these different factors, but people and in welcoming, if you will, the role of outsider, I think makes a big deal or a big difference.
Wow, Steve, that's just really insightful that it's not about places, but it's about the people, and that we're all living in and immersed in living cultures. I love
Right.
that. Steve, I just really, really, have been enriched by our conversation. And I want to ask you if people want to get a copy of Hidden Travel or The Creative Wild, where can they find that? Where can they get your books?
It's on most of the places, most bookstores. Now, and again, I don't know in Australia how easy it is to get. I do know, occasionally you see the royalty checks from Australia come in. It's always kind of interesting to see where they do sell the books. But for the most part, Amazon. And here in the United States, I would say, yeah, local bookstores can do it. Um, Barnes and Noble, Apple, different ones like that. Creative Wild will be out in October, so no one's going to be able to get it except like an advanced reader copy before, not October, excuse me, January. It was October, publisher moved it back. So it's now January that it'll be out. So like late January, you can get Creative Wild just about any place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve. I really value your input, and it's just been a very, very enriching experience. Thank you for what you do, and all the best with the launch of your book, The Creative File, in January.
All right. Thanks, Lydia.